Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Welcome everyone, I am Reya and I will be your host today. I'm a partner in the sports group at Mishcon Academy and I specialise in immigration. The impact of COVID-19 on the sports industry has been dramatic, and some would say it's been the biggest impact ever. Even during ancient times, wars would be paused while the Olympics were held, and during World War II, which was the last biggest disruptor of sports, some sports such as cricket and baseball found a way to continue. However, COVID-19 has effectively shut down sport as we know it for the last couple of months. But are we now at a turning point? What is next for sports as we know it? What will be the impact on contracts and governance, and what are the legal steps governing bodies, clubs, and athletes should be taking now in anticipation for a post-lockdown world? What will the challenges and opportunities be going forward? Well, we have a fantastic panel for you today to answer those very questions. We have John Mirzad QC of Littleton Chambers. We also have Moya Dodd. Moya is a former Australian international footballer and one of the first 3 women on FIFA's executive committee. And last but not least, we have our very own Simon Leaf, who is the new head of our sports group at Mishcon Academy. What are the 1 or 2 reoccurring themes that each of you are seeing post-corona from worried clients or contacts in the sports industry, whether that's players, clubs, agents, or regulators? Moya, if you can go first.
I think that the common recurring themes that I'm seeing and hearing is, first of all, in this early phase, it's like you've been dropped into the middle of the maze and people are trying to find their way out. There's just been a sudden, dropping off the edge of a cliff of cash flows, of revenues. The other, I think, underlying worry now is that I think there's a perception that this is not going to go back to as it was, certainly not quickly. So there's an intervening period where we need to live with COVID and try and help sport sort of on a recovery path while we're living with COVID.
Now we've moved on to going back to a stage where we are contemplating resuming a new season. What happens to the clubs who are relegated or promoted or not, or miss out on prize money or European qualification? What redress do they have?
I think the 2 main themes that we're seeing so far are firstly uncertainty. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen next. And following on from that is caution. I don't think anybody is kind of acting in haste or taking steps, kind of firm steps now to kind of enforce their rights. But I think in the background, people are looking at what those rights would be and preparing themselves in case seasons are unable to be completed or decisions are taken that would kind of adversely prejudice their interests.
What impact will the suspension of sport, including the disruption to broadcast arrangements, have in the medium and long term?
I think in the medium term, really we are looking at a kind of more depressed market in all aspects of sport. On the kind of broadcasting side, we've, even before the kind of pandemic hit, we kind of heard of difficulties that Premiership Rugby were having in agreeing a new TV rights deal for the Premiership from 2021. I think there are kind of opportunities out there as well, particularly for rights holders. There are certain categories that haven't been adversely impacted by the pandemic. There are kind of potential opportunities in the medium term to perhaps focus their efforts on those kind of brands that have had a good crisis. Longer term, inevitably there will be changes. Brands and particularly the broadcasters will be looking at getting value from contracts going forward. So I think we will see more of a breakdown on how those rights are split up.
This is a really interesting and perhaps pivotal point in broadcast history, I think, because live sport has always been considered to be the driver of eyeballs. And we were always in a transitional phase right now between broadcast and digital, and perhaps this will accelerate it. There's, of course, all sorts of arm wrestling going on over these agreements now. Will they be terminated? Will they be renegotiated? And, while all of that goes on, I think the innovators of the industry will be thinking about, well, what does an empty stadium look like? And already people are selling tickets, sort of virtual tickets. There are screens that go up and you can get your little block on the screen and the players can actually run over to the screen and celebrate in front of their, looks like a Zoom call with hundreds of fans in there, or even have a stadium that's kind of like a big studio. So I think all of these things will actually make the clubs more directly connected with their fans, and perhaps they will move more towards a business that's driven by the value of data, customer data.
UEFA recently announced new guidelines for eligibility in international competitions, which is due to the fact that it's becoming more and more clear that some of the football leagues are not going to complete the 19-20 season. John, can you tell us what kind of legal ramifications there could be as a result of leagues failing to complete their seasons?
UEFA were absolutely adamant at the beginning of April that seasons should be finished. They went so far as to suggest that disciplinary action could be taken against national associations if they didn't do so. The Belgian league that has effectively come to an end, it's the Dutch league that's come to an end. In response to that, UEFA at the end of April have come out with new guidelines. National associations should still try to end their seasons, and if not, come up with a sort of alternative way of ending a season. And in the event that seasons have to be cancelled, then decisions has to be based on objective, transparent and non-discriminatory criteria. These have to be a set of procedures that are proposed, that are voted upon at national level and are agreed under the respective rules of each domestic association. Within the Premier League and the EFL, the key decision maker is the FA. If the FA agrees to an amendment to its rule, then we move on to a vote at board level within the Premier League and the EFL. Within the Premier League, each one of the 20 clubs are a shareholder. To cut a long story short, 14 out of 20 of them have to vote in favour of whatever's proposed. But there are inevitably going to be some clubs who will be disgruntled with the decision. Those clubs effectively have two forms of actions. One is a breach of contract, because everything I've just said in terms of procedures and rules is a contractual framework. If those procedures aren't followed properly, adequate notice isn't given, votes aren't carried out properly, then that is obviously a breach of contract. Secondly, we have a shareholders' action called unfair prejudice. And minority shareholders can suggest that they've been prejudiced. And most clubs would like to stop any decision in its tracks. And that would mean an injunction application, most likely to be based on procedures not being followed properly or obvious prejudice.
So Santosh has asked about force majeure. Can you just explain to us very briefly, John or Simon, what it is and how is it going to affect sports contracts?
A force majeure clause is effectively a contractual clause. That contractual clause is subject to normal principles of contractual interpretation, and there are two things that it needs to set out. One is reference to particular events. So in terms of the situation we're in, it is a pandemic. And secondly, the consequences of that particular event. And so the general consequences are that the contract will terminate with immediate effect, and there may be a sort of a pro-rating of the sums which have been payable depending on what's been provided under those sums. A good example is Wimbledon, that apparently it had a force majeure clause covering unusually the specific event of a pandemic. There are actually relatively few that cover this particular event.
Generally speaking, what people need to bear in mind at the moment is if they are entering into new contracts, that won't actually help the party at the moment unless they kind of say that the force majeure event includes COVID. Often the kind of force majeure clauses that we include in the kind of complex sponsorship agreements and broadcasting agreements that we draft will tend to have had a long stop date in them. Effectively, the party that has had to continue performing, which is usually the paying party, may reach a point where the tipping point is reached, and that party then has a right to usually kind of terminate the agreement, or at least then have a right to renegotiate.
What happens if players feel uncomfortable or unsafe playing? Can the clubs force the players to play? What's your view on that?
The general employer-employee contract is based on so-called mutuality of obligation. But these are not straightforward circumstances, that there are well-known decisions, and there are also statutory provisions that means that where the health and safety of a player, or indeed any employee, staff member, coach or otherwise, is in serious or imminent danger, then a player and that employee can refuse to train or to play. That is based on the reasonable belief of that particular employee. And that belief can actually be wrong, but provided that incorrect belief was, if you like, reasonable in the first place, then they can still avail of protections under that statute. If they suffer any form of detriment, which means fines, dismissals, not being paid, then they are protected under legislation, and they can seek recompense through the tribunal system.
Moya, what changes to sporting rules and regulations are likely to arise from the pandemic, and what can be done now to prepare for them? There's been some calls for financial fair play to be abolished and things like that. Can you give us kind of an idea of what your thoughts are on this?
Well, I think it's very difficult to be precise in predicting what rules and regulations will come forward, because the big question is who is going to be left at the table. We're already hearing perceptions that perhaps, people are resetting their view of sport. So people are getting back into participation again. They're thinking of sport or exercise as something that they do rather than something that they watch. The big players will find their way through this, but there's at risk a whole layer below that, layer or 2 or 3 tiers below that are at risk. Or may survive in a much a smaller form in terms of their economic size.
I think it's worth kind of bearing in mind the kind of context of where we are at the moment with governance and regulatory issues in sport. It's well known that Man City have had issues with UEFA on financial fair play, and we really saw a kind of strengthening of the regulators, and the regulators kind of showing their teeth. After the pandemic, in lots of other areas outside of sport, we've heard about regulatory forbearance, where effectively regulators have said, we are now going to go easy on kind of companies and organisations because we appreciate that we're in such difficult times. I just think it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few months, particularly with financial fair play. As things stand, other than the UEFA rules, which do have a kind of force majeure provision, the Premier League and Football League equivalent financial fair play rules don't. Certain clubs are kind of nervous about kind of putting funds into the club at the moment because they're concerned that it may mean that they inadvertently breach financial fair play rules by doing the right thing and continuing to kind of pay staff and pay players. So I think it's really important that regulators kind of step up and kind of show that ultimately the rules were designed for a particular purpose. The kind of current crisis clearly wasn't foreseeable, and there should be kind of greater tolerance for those that are unable to comply because of the pandemic.
I've been reading, as have a lot of the audience members as well, many articles since the lockdown warning about the demise of women's sport post-COVID. Do you think that these fears are justified, and is there anything that we can do to avoid it?
I think any time there is cost cutting and sort of economic shrinkage, you have to be very conscious of which bits you're going to cut. And I think women's sports advocates are right to be concerned about it because women's sport is so underrepresented at the decision-making table. 100 years ago was the year when 53,000 people crammed into Goodison Park and watched 2 women's club teams play each other. Women's football was banned from the stadiums, and men's football accelerated away for 50 years or more. And frankly, in 100 years, we have never recovered to the position that we were in 1920. It is a big opportunity to reset things. If you treat the products equally, then the difference in demand, there actually isn't a difference in demand. I mean, if you don't assume the demand's not there, then you actually find that it is there.
Exactly. I like that rallying call. And it's a good place to stop. It just remains for me to say thank you to all of the audience for joining us today, and especially to our speakers for their amazing insight and advice. For our latest guidance and online content related to COVID-19, please visit our hub at mishcon.com/COVID-19. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us on our dedicated email address, coronavirus@mishcon.com. Thank you again, everyone. See you.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.